Her name was Clara Mave Dolan. She was 81 years old, and she was dying in a charity ward in Omaha, Nebraska, in the spring of 1961. The nurses thought she was confused. She kept talking about a train. She kept repeating the same sentence in a voice that had gone thin and papery with age. She said, "I remember who I was before they gave me away. Nobody wrote it down. Nobody thought it mattered." But Clara Dolan was the last surviving rider of the orphan trains, the greatest forced migration of children in American history. And what she remembered, what she had carried inside herself for more than 70 years, was not the story America liked to tell about those trains. It was the real one. The official version says the orphan trains were mercy. It says Charles Loring Brace, the man who created them, was a visionary philanthropist who rescued nearly 200,000 children from the squalor of New York City streets and gave them new lives in the wholesome farmlands of the American heartland. That version appeared in textbooks. It was repeated in newspapers. It was taught to generations of American school children as an example of private charity working exactly as it should, the market solving a social problem without government interference. But the truth is, that story leaves out almost everything that mattered. The orphan trains were not primarily a charity program. They were a labor redistribution system, built at the exact moment American agriculture needed cheap child labor on a massive scale. The children on those trains were not orphans. Most of them had living parents, and the families those children were placed with were not properly vetted, not closely monitored, and not held accountable for what happened behind their doors. Clara Dolan knew all of this because she had lived all of this, and before she died, she told a young nursing student named Rosemary Atkins everything she could still remember. Rosemary kept the notes for 40 years. She thought someone official would eventually come asking for them. Nobody ever did. To understand what the orphan trains really were, you first have to understand what they were supposed to be. The story begins in 1853 in New York City. The city has a problem that its newspapers are calling a crisis. Tens of thousands of children are living and dying in the streets of Lower Manhattan. They are picking pockets, they are sleeping under piers, they are dying of cholera and typhus, and simple exposure in alleyways the rest of the city pretends not to see. The newspapers call them street Arabs. They call them waifs. They call them the dangerous classes. And the language itself tells you something important. These children are not being seen as victims of poverty or immigration policy or catastrophic tenement conditions. They are being seen as a threat, a contagion, a problem to be managed. Into that moment steps Charles Loring Brace. He is 27 years old, a Yale-educated minister's son from Connecticut, burning with evangelical energy and progressive ideas. He founds the Children's Aid Society in 1853. He writes pamphlets. He raises money. He gives lectures. He is extraordinarily effective at all of it. Then, in 1854, he proposes a solution. He calls it placing out. On the surface, the idea sounds simple. Take the children off the streets of New York, put them on trains. Send them west to farming families who will take them in, feed them, clothe them, educate them, and raise them as their own. The newspapers love it. The donors love it. The city government, which has been spending money on overcrowded orphan asylums for decades, loves it most of all. But the real question, the question almost nobody asks in the pamphlets, the fundraising letters, or the newspaper coverage, is this. Who exactly are these children, and what happens to them after the train leaves? That answer changes everything. The children on the orphan trains were, in the overwhelming majority, not orphans. A study published decades later, drawing on Children's Aid Society records, found that fewer than 1 in 4 of the children sent west had lost both parents. Most had one living parent. Many had 2. These were children whose families had been torn apart, not by death, but by poverty, and by the deliberate choices of a system that treated poverty as a moral failing instead of an economic condition. Clara Dolan's mother was alive when Clara was put on a train in 1886. Her name was Bridget Dolan. She was Irish. She was a widow. and she was working 14-hour days in a garment factory on Mulberry Street for wages that could not cover rent and food and coal for a family of 3 children. She did not surrender Clara willingly. She did not sign papers. She came home from work one evening to find that the Children's Aid Society had visited her building, spoken to her landlord, and decided that her children were living in conditions of neglect. Clara was 7 years old. Her mother was not neglectful, she was poor. And in 1886 in New York City, those two things were treated as if they were exactly the same. Now this is the moment where the standard history of the orphan trains stops being a story about charity and starts becoming a story about labor markets. Because the timing of the orphan trains was not accidental, it fits almost perfectly onto the rise of American agricultural expansion. The years between 1854 and 1929, the years the trains ran, were the years of the great westward agricultural push. The Homestead Act of 1862 opened millions of acres of federal land to settlement. Railroad companies were driving tracks across Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, Missouri, and far beyond. New farms were being cut out of prairies season after season. And those farms needed labor. Adult farm hands cost money. They had to be paid wages. They could organize. They could leave. Children from the orphan trains cost nothing. They came with no contracts. They had no legal standing. They could not leave because they had nowhere to go and no money to get there. And if a family wanted to send a child back, the process was so cumbersome and so badly administered that it almost never happened. Charles Loring Brace understood exactly what he was building. He was not naive. In his own writings, he described the program as a solution to 2 problems at once: the surplus of destitute children in the cities and the shortage of labor in the rural West. He used the word labor. He used the phrase farm help. In his 1872 book, The Dangerous Classes of New York and 20 Years' Work Among Them, he wrote that the Western farmer received not just a child, but a worker. And once you hear those words plainly, the charitable language begins to split open. Because a system designed to provide workers is not a system designed first for the welfare of children. It is a system designed for the welfare of the people receiving them. The families who took in orphan train children were not required to adopt them. They were not required to educate them. They were not required to pay them. They signed a piece of paper agreeing, in the vaguest possible language, to treat the child as a member of the family. But there was no real enforcement, no reliable follow-up, no meaningful way for the child to complain. The Children's Aid Society employed traveling agents whose job was to visit placed children and check on their condition. But those agents were responsible for territories covering hundreds of square miles. They visited each child at most once a year, usually less. And what that meant in practice was brutal. A child placed on a farm in Nebraska in October might not see a representative of the organization that sent her there until the following harvest, at the earliest. And by that time, if something terrible had already happened, the child had likely learned what happened to children who complained. Clara Dolan learned that lesson in the winter of 1886, in a farmhouse outside Beatrice, Nebraska, 4 months after she arrived. Rosemary Atkins was 19 years old in 1961. She was a nursing student at Emmanuel Hospital in Omaha, and she had been assigned to the charity ward as part of her training. The charity ward was where they put the patients who had nobody and nothing, the ones who were going to die and be buried in county plots if no family came forward. Clara Dolan had been in that ward for 11 days when Rosemary was assigned to care for her. What Rosemary remembered 40 years later, when a researcher finally found her in a retirement community in Scottsdale, Arizona, was that Clara did not seem confused at all. She seemed deliberate. She seemed like someone who had been waiting a very long time to say certain things aloud, and who understood she was running out of time to say them. Clara told Rosemary that she had been 7 years old when the agent from the Children's Aid Society came to her building on M Street. She remembered the man's coat. She remembered his clipboard. She remembered that he smelled like tobacco and something sweet, like fruit that had already begun to turn. She remembered the train, too. Not only the sadness of it, though she said she cried for 3 days. What stayed with her were the physical details, the wooden seats, the smell of coal smoke, the way the other children, 22 of them from her car alone, pressed their faces against the windows as the city disappeared. She said the city went away, like something being erased. They stopped in a town in Indiana, and some children got off. They stopped in Ohio, and more got off. By the time the train reached Nebraska, there were 6 children left in Clarara's car. They were the ones nobody had wanted yet. And Clarara said she understood, even at 7 years old, what it meant to still be on that train that far west. She understood that she was becoming cheaper. The family that took her was named Hartwell, Elias Hartwell and his wife Louise. They had a corn and hog operation outside Beatrice. They had 2 sons of their own, both older than Clarara, and they had requested a girl specifically, something Clarara said she did not understand until much later. They had requested a girl because they needed someone for the domestic work, the cooking, the cleaning, the washing, the mending, the churning, all the labor Louise Hartwell's back could no longer sustain. Clarara was not a daughter. She was a replacement for a hired girl, and she was cheaper than a hired girl because she came with no wage attached. Clarara told Rosemary that she was not beaten. She was careful about that. She said the Hartwells were not cruel in the way people usually mean when they use that word. They did not strike her. They fed her. She had a bed, a real bed, in a room off the kitchen. But she also said this, and it matters just as much. They never once pretended, not for a single day, that she was a member of the family. She ate after the family ate. She was not introduced to neighbors. She was not allowed to attend church with the family for the first 2 years because, as Elias Hartwell told her without embarrassment, he did not want people asking where she came from. She was not enrolled in school until she was 9, and even then only for 4 months of the year, when the farm did not need her labor. She told Rosemary she remembered the exact moment she understood her situation completely. It was the winter of 1886. She was sick. She thought it was influenza, and she stayed in bed for a day. Louise Hartwell came to the doorway of her room and said, in a voice that was not unkind but absolutely final, "Clarara, the eggs do not collect themselves." Clarara got up. She collected the eggs, and she said she cried while doing it, not from sadness, but from something she did not yet have a word for. She said she found the word about 30 years later. The word was clarity. Now step back from Clarara's story for a moment and look at the scale of what the Orphan Train program actually represented. Because when you look at the numbers, the charitable framing becomes even harder to defend. In fact, it begins to collapse under its own weight. Between 1854 and 1929, the Children's Aid Society and similar organizations placed approximately 200,000 children in rural homes across 35 states and 4 Canadian provinces. 200,000 children over 75 years of operation. That is not a small act of mercy. That is not a side project of benevolence. That is an industry. And like any industry, it had economic incentives built into its structure, incentives that shaped the outcomes it produced. The Children's Aid Society received funding from New York City government based on the number of children it removed from city streets. More placements meant more funding. It is important to sit with that for a second. More placements meant more money. That created pressure, internal pressure, to increase the volume of children processed through the system. On the receiving end, the demand from farming communities was not steady. It rose and fell with the agricultural calendar. It spiked during planting season. It spiked during harvest. The agents who traveled with the trains kept records, and many of those records survived into the 20th century. What they show is a very clear seasonal pattern in placements. Children were most likely to be taken from trains in April and in September. April is planting. September is harvest. That detail matters. It matters a lot because it tells you the children were not being placed according to where they would flourish. They were being placed according to where they were needed most. And then there is another number the standard histories almost never linger on. Of the approximately 200,000 children placed by the orphan trains, historians who have studied the program estimate that somewhere between 30% and 40% were eventually returned to the organization. Returned, like goods that failed to satisfy expectations. Returned like something that did not work as promised. The return rate was high enough that the Children's Aid Society eventually created a standard form for it, a form with checkboxes. The reasons listed included child unsuitable for farm work, child of difficult disposition, child too young for placement, and child's health unsatisfactory. Notice what is missing. None of the checkboxes said we worked this child too hard and she became sick. None of them said the boy we took had a learning difficulty and we could not use him. None of them said we changed our minds. But really, those were often the reasons. And when children were returned, they did not go home. They went back into the system. They were put on another train, offered to another family, moved again. Some children rode the trains multiple times. There are records of children who were placed, returned, placed again, returned again, 3 and 4 times before the system finally gave up on finding them a situation and deposited them in a state institution. Clara was never returned, but she knew children who were. She met a boy named Thomas, never learned his last name, on the train going out. Years later, she heard from another child that Thomas had been sent back twice and had ended up in a reformatory in Kansas. She never found out what became of him after that, but she said she thought about Thomas for the rest of her life. She said he had a way of laughing that made everything feel slightly less terrible, and that she had never heard anyone laugh quite like that again. And this is where the question becomes unavoidable. How did a system like this continue for 75 years without a serious public reckoning? The answer has several parts, and each one reveals something cold and familiar about how economic systems protect themselves from accountability. The first part is the narrative built around the program from the beginning. Charles Loring Brace was not just an administrator. He was an extraordinarily skilled propagandist in the neutral sense of that word. He understood something essential. The survival of the program depended on public support, and public support depended on a very specific story being told and believed. The story he told was rescue. The children were in danger. The streets were destroying them. The program was saving them. That framing made the program almost impossible to criticize, because any criticism could be recast as opposition to saving children. And that is a powerful shield. Really, it is one of the most durable shields any institution can build for itself. The helper becomes the hero, and the helped become voiceless. The children on the orphan trains were voiceless in the most literal sense. They had no legal standing. They could not vote. They could not sue. They could not go to newspapers and demand that someone hear them. A child who tried to complain about her situation usually faced one of two responses. Either she was not believed, or she was told that her complaint proved she was ungrateful for the mercy she had been shown. The second part of the silence was economic. The farming communities that received orphan train children were not about to complain. They benefited from the system. They were the winners inside it. And those communities had political representation, substantial representation in state legislatures and in Congress. The children who had been placed had no such representation. That is the asymmetry that allows exploitative systems to endure. The people who benefit have power. The people who are harmed do not. And because the entire structure is wrapped in moral language, even suggesting harm becomes socially uncomfortable. That discomfort is not accidental. It is part of the design. The third part of the silence is the one Clara Dolan identified herself. And honestly, it may be the most devastating of all because it reaches so deeply into the human mind. She told Rosemary, "The worst thing they did was make us grateful." She did not mean that as a theatrical line. She meant it as a mechanism. She said the children who survived the orphan trains who built lives out of whatever they had been given, who married, had families, and grew old. Those children developed an enormous psychological investment in the official story that the trains had saved them. To believe otherwise, to really believe that what had happened was not rescue but exploitation, was to believe that their entire lives had been built on something ugly. Most people cannot do that. Most people will choose the story that lets them keep going. So the survivors who did reasonably well, the ones whose voices might have mattered, mostly repeated the official story. They repeated it because it was easier. They repeated it because, over time, they had come to believe it. And by repeating it, they helped bury the experiences of the children who had not done well, the ones who had been returned, the ones who had been broken, the Thomases who vanished into reformatories and institutions and silence. Clara said she had told the official story herself for most of her life. She had told it to her husband. She had told it to her children. She said she stopped believing it sometime around 1930, when the Depression came and she watched what happened to poor families and poor children, and suddenly recognized the machinery of it. She recognized the shape because she had lived inside it. She said, "I had seen it work on me, and I knew the shape of it." But even then, she kept telling the official version, because by then, the story had become part of who she was. And once a story has lived inside a person long enough, it is very hard to remove it without tearing something vital. She told Rosemary, "I am only telling you the real one now because I am about to be dead, and the dead do not need to be grateful to anyone. Now put the economic case together plainly, because it deserves to be seen all at once." The Orphan Train program existed at the intersection of three economic pressures. The first was urban labor surplus. New York City in the second half of the 19th century, receiving enormous waves of immigration, primarily from Ireland and from Southern and Eastern Europe. These immigrants arrived poor, often destitute, and crowded into the tenement districts of Lower Manhattan and Brooklyn under conditions that were genuinely brutal. Their children were not, in the main, abandoned or neglected in any meaningful sense. They were poor. That was the condition. That was the crime. And in the economic and moral framework of Gilded Age America, being poor was treated as evidence of moral failure. Once poverty was framed that way, it became easier to strip families of sympathy and easier still to strip them of their children. The second pressure was agricultural labor demand. The homesteading of the Great Plains required labor, and that labor was chronically undersupplied. Adult farmhands were expensive. By the 1870s and 1880s, they had begun making wage demands that cut into the margins of small and medium farming operations. Children were not organized. Children could not make wage demands. Children who had been removed from their families and transported across the country were structurally in the position of indentured workers without indenture contracts. They were bound not by a document, but by complete helplessness. They had nowhere to go. They had no money. They had no family. They could not leave. The third pressure was philanthropic finance. The Children's Aid Society was not a government program. It was a private charity, funded by donors from New York's merchant and professional classes. Those donors had a particular worldview. They believed that the deserving poor could be improved through discipline and honest work, and that the rural farm, with its Protestant ethic and distance from the corrupting city, was the ideal setting for that transformation. But really, that belief was not disinterested. That is the detail that deserves more attention than it usually gets. Many of those donors were people who owned factories and businesses employing the parents of these children. They had a direct financial interest in maintaining a labor force that remained cheap and controllable. Funding the orphan trains did not conflict with that interest. In a very real sense, it served it. By removing the surplus children of the urban poor from the city, the program reduced the visibility of poverty without reducing poverty itself. It made the problem less visible. That made donors less uncomfortable, and that made the status quo easier to preserve. This is the economic argument in its starkest form. The orphan trains were not a solution to child poverty. They were a mechanism for making child poverty invisible in the cities where wealthy people lived, while redistributing the labor of poor children to places where that labor could be economically exploited. That is a brutal conclusion, but the numbers point there, and Clara Dolan was not the only survivor who eventually told a different story. She was simply among the last. Beginning in the 1970s, a small group of researchers started trying to collect oral histories from aging orphan train survivors before they all died. What they found, when they found survivors willing to speak honestly, looked almost nothing like the official narrative. They found survivors who had worked from before dawn until after dark, on farms in Kansas and Nebraska and Missouri, from the time they were 8 and 9 years old, in conditions that today would be classified as child labor. They found survivors who had never been enrolled in school, who grew into adulthood functionally illiterate because the families who took them needed their labor more than their education. They found survivors who had been placed with families that later dissolved through death or divorce or financial ruin, and who were then passed from household to household, sometimes 5 and 6 times before they were old enough to simply walk away. They found survivors who spent their entire adult lives searching for their birth families and never found them, not because their parents were dead, but because the records the Children's Aid Society kept were incomplete, inconsistently organized, and in some cases so vague that tracing a family became nearly impossible. They found survivors who did not know their own birthdays, survivors who did not know their real names because the families who took them renamed them, sometimes on the day they arrived. And that detail brings us back to Clara Dolan. She was not Clara when she got on the train. She was Maeve. Maeve Bridget Dolan. The Hartwells called her Clara because they said Maeve sounded foreign, and they did not want to explain it. She had been Clara for 74 years by the time she died, but she told Rosemary that inside, she had never stopped thinking of herself as Maeve. She said, "They took my name first. Everything else came after." There is one more dimension of the Orphan Train story that the standard histories handle very poorly, and it has to do with race. The children on the orphan trains were predominantly white. They were predominantly Irish and Italian and Eastern European Jewish. In its early decades, the Children's Aid Society did occasionally place black children, but the rural communities receiving orphan trains were often unwilling to take non-white children, and the society adjusted itself to that preference. What that means, in economic terms, is deeply revealing. The orphan train system was a racialized labor redistribution program. It moved the surplus children of white immigrant families to white farming communities across the rural West. Black children in New York, living in poverty that was often just as severe, sometimes worse, were largely excluded even from this deeply flawed form of intervention. There is a grotesque logic to that once you look directly at the period. The years the orphan trains ran were the years of rapid expansion in the agricultural economy of the American heartland. That economy, in its earlier form, had been built on enslaved black labor. After emancipation, it needed a new form of cheap, controllable agricultural labor. It got part of that labor from the orphan trains, which supplied white children to white farmers. The children on those trains were exploited, but they were exploited in a way that also reinforced the racial architecture of American agriculture. White labor was being delivered to white farms, reducing the economic incentive to integrate those farms or to bring black workers north and west in significant numbers. Clara Dolan did not frame it this way. She did not have that analytical vocabulary, but she told Rosemary something that points in the same direction. She said that when she arrived at the Hartwell farm, there had briefly been a black farmhand named George who worked for wages. He left within a year of Clara's arrival. She had always assumed he left because better wages were being offered elsewhere, but she remembered that Elias Hartwell never replaced him. He did not need to. Clara could do the domestic work George had not been doing. That freed Louise Hartwell to do more field work, and that reduced the need for a paid outside hand. She said, "I understand now that I was cheaper than George, and that was the point." The orphan train program stopped running in 1929, The official explanation says changing social attitudes about child welfare made the program obsolete. The growth of foster care systems and child labor laws meant the specific conditions the program had relied on no longer existed in the same form. That explanation is not wrong, but really, it is incomplete. What actually ended the orphan trains was a collision with three forces the program could not outlast. The first was the progressive movement's focus on child labor reform. By the first decade of the 20th century, reformers had begun investigating and publicizing the conditions under which children lived and worked in American industry. The National Child Labor Committee, founded in 1904, conducted investigations and published photographs that shocked middle-class Americans who had previously given little thought to the labor of children, and that changed the political atmosphere. Once child labor became harder to ignore in factories, it also became harder to defend on farms, especially when the labor was being disguised as rescue. The second force was the professionalization of social work. By the 1910s and 1920s, social work was becoming an academic discipline with professional standards and trained practitioners. These new professionals looked at the orphan train system and saw what it really was: an unregulated, unmonitored placement program with no systematic follow-up, no legal protections for placed children, and no meaningful accountability for receiving families. They did not like what they saw, and they said so, loudly and repeatedly. The third force was the Depression. The economic catastrophe of 1929 destroyed the demand for orphan train children almost overnight. Farming families that might once have been willing to take in a child when times were good were suddenly struggling to feed their own households. The receiving end of the pipeline collapsed, and without that demand, the program no longer had a function. But what did not happen, and what tells you almost everything about the program's legacy, was a reckoning. There was no formal investigation into what had happened to the children who had been placed. There was no systematic effort to reconnect those children with their birth families. There was no acknowledgement from the Children's Aid Society or from any level of government that the program had been built in ways that allowed exploitation to flourish. The program simply stopped, and then its survivors did what survivors so often do. The ones who had done reasonably well told the official story, and the ones who had not done well were mostly dead, or silent, or living in conditions that gave them no platform from which to speak. Clara Dolan was living on Social Security and a small pension from a laundry where she had worked for 30 years. She had no platform. She had no institution behind her. She had no audience waiting to listen. She had Rosemary, a 19-year-old nursing student assigned to her bed in a charity ward, so she used what she had. Rosemary Atkins graduated from nursing school in 1963. She worked as a nurse for 31 years. She married, had 3 children, and moved to Arizona in 1987. And all that time, she kept the notes she had made during Clara's final days in a shoebox in a closet. She kept them because something in her told her they mattered. She did not know to whom, she did not know how to make them matter, but she kept them. Then, in 2001, a historian named Patricia Fagan, who was writing a book about orphan train survivors, found Rosemary through a chain of connections involving a retired social worker in Omaha who remembered hearing about a nursing student who had once spoken with one of the last riders. Fagan spent 2 days with Rosemary in Scottsdale, going through the notes. What she found was not a polished testimony, it was fragments. It was the words of a dying 81-year-old woman, spoken to a 19-year-old who was writing as fast as she could and not always catching every phrase. But the fragments were enough. Fagan published them in an appendix to her book, which came out in 2004, received respectful reviews in academic journals, and was then, for the most part, ignored by the wider public. The appendix is 16 pages long. It is titled, What Clara Said, and among the things Clara said were these. My mother was not a bad woman. She was a poor woman. They decided those were the same thing. She said, the man on the train told us we were going to good homes. He believed it. I think that was the worst part. He believed it. She said, I looked for my mother for 40 years. I wrote letters. Nobody at the society ever wrote back. I think the records were not kept the way they said they were kept. She said, Louise Hartwell was not a cruel woman, but I was never a child in that house. I was a function. Do you understand what that means? A function. Something that did what it was supposed to do. She said, I had children of my own, 3 of them. I was a good mother. I know I was. But I was always afraid. I was always afraid that something would come and take them. I never stopped being afraid of that. Not once. Not even when they were grown. And then she said, tell someone. I do not know who, but tell someone. Clara Dolan died on April 14, 1961. She was buried in a county plot in Douglas County, Nebraska. The marker is a small stone with her name and the years of her birth and death. Nothing else. And maybe that is fitting in a bleak way, because the lesson of the Orphan Trains is not primarily about individual cruelty. It is about structure. It is about what happens when a program designed to serve an economic function is allowed to dress itself in the language of charity, and what that disguise makes invisible. The language of charity made the orphan trains invisible as an economic system. It made the labor extraction invisible. It made the displacement of families invisible. It made the fact that most of these children were not orphans invisible. It made the systematic exclusion of black children invisible. It made the seasonal correlation between placements and harvest schedules invisible. And above all, it made the children themselves invisible. Because children who have been rescued are not supposed to be victims. Children who have been saved are expected to carry a debt. And children who complain about being saved are called ungrateful. Ungrateful children do not get hurt. This pattern was not unique to the orphan trains. That is what makes it feel so disturbingly modern. It appears again and again in the history of programs that use vulnerable populations to solve economic problems while maintaining a moral alibi. It appeared in the Indian boarding school system, which ran in parallel with the orphan trains and used almost the same language of rescue and improvement. It appears in the history of welfare reform, where the language of opportunity and self-sufficiency has repeatedly been used to reduce support for people in poverty while demanding their labor in return for diminished assistance. The pattern is always the same. Identify a population with no political power. Frame their condition as a moral problem requiring intervention. Design an intervention that serves economic interests while appearing to serve the people inside it. Build a story around that intervention that makes criticism feel immoral, and make sure the people harmed by it have no platform from which to contradict the story. That is what Clara Maeve Dolan understood. She had learned it with her body over 81 years, beginning on the day a man with a clipboard and the smell of turning fruit came to her building on M Street and decided that her mother's poverty was the same thing as her mother's failure. She told Rosemary, I am not angry. I am too old to be angry. But I want someone to know that I knew. I always knew. I knew what I was for. I knew why they put me on that train. And I knew it was not for my benefit. Then she paused. And after that she said, knowing it did not help me, but maybe it will help someone. Now you know. If this is the kind of history that stays with you, the kind that looks behind the official version and asks who benefited, who paid the price, and what was buried to keep the story clean, then leave your thoughts below. If this story moved you, give it a like, subscribe, and stay with us for the next one.